It's my good friend David James on board with us this morning. Happy New Year, my friend.
Oh, same to you. Happy New Year.
Well, listen, a lot to talk about when you talk about education. I was reading over the holidays as we went into 2026 because open enrollment has been part of the education vocabulary for many years. But many districts are saying it's not advantageous as much anymore to maybe bring in these students with open enrollment when you talk about cost per student and some of the other things. Are you seeing that as well? And maybe even shed us some light on what some of the concerns are with open enrollment.
Right. Yeah. With certain districts, they're ranked and they have this wealth index. And so that'll determine how much state share funding they get. And for a district that might get a lower amount of state share, you get open enrollment students, they're going to have to pay more local dollars to support those students. So there's always a question on if you're bringing in a lot of open enrollment students, and we've seen this in our area some years ago with one district that they had a lot of open enrollment students, particularly from Akron, and then some of the voters weren't passing levies because they were like, why should we support students who don't live here who are coming in? But on the other hand, the positive aspects of open enrollment, could be if you have, magnet programs, such as Akron has Miller South's, the Visual and Performing Arts School, the STEM schools, things like that, or college and career academies, you may want to bring in students, particularly many of our districts are facing, enrollment declines just because of demographics. And so it's going to be dependent on each individual district and their finances. And I know there are a couple of examples today where I think there are some questions about whether that open enrollment process is advantageous to a district or not. In addition, in the legislature, there's a House Bill 294, I believe, that will have some changes to open enrollment, where I believe districts will have to determine the number of seats that are available per grade level, post those on a website. There are also requirements, I think, in that bill that talk about how you can reject a student for open enrollment and what the criteria is. So there will be some additional, requirements if that bill passes on open enrollment, and that may impact that situation with our schools across the state.
He's the executive director of the Summit Education Initiative, David James. And there's so many variables with this topic, right? Because you mentioned, and I won't pick on a certain district, but let's say school number A has a real drop in their enrollment because the town is shrinking.
Exactly.
Also, though, when you look at dollars coming in from Columbus, a lot of that is dependent on enrollment. So there's a part of the board in that particular area that says, okay, let's keep open enrollment so we can keep our enrollment up. But then there's other people that say, well, we're going to vote this down because they're not our area's students. That's a difficult spot, isn't it?
It is, and that's the problem when you have 600 plus school districts in Ohio and other states. They have countywide districts. So I think it's just something that is gonna like I said, each individual district has their own circumstances and whether financially it's viable to have a certain amount of open enrollment. There are some districts that don't even have open enrollment. And so it's going to be up to each district superintendent, board of education, and treasurer to figure that formula out for that particular district.
David, just so everyone understands, when we talk about open enrollment, who determines the specific guidelines for open enrollment for that specific district? Is it the Board of Education? Is it their council? Is it the principal? How does that shake out?
I remember when I was superintendent, I would get a letter from Ohio Department of Education that would say I had to fill out a form whether we are allowing inside our district open enrollment, which Akron did, and whether we allowed outside open enrollment, so students could come in from outside the district, whether our borders are open or closed. And so, I think that state law governs that primarily. Then the district can decide whether they're going to open their borders or not open their borders. And so we do have some districts that don't have open enrollment that allow kids coming in from outside of the district.
If there was, and again, this is just another question, I'm trying to simplify it so people understand open enrollment a little bit. Let's say school district here is bordered by school district B.
Yes.
Open enrollment there. But could you go Let me just pick two schools out to make it
Hmm.
easier for you. Let's say Barberton and someone from Talmadge wants to go to school in Barberton for whatever reason. Maybe the parents work in Barberton and it's easier to get. Can they do that, or does it have to be a neighboring district?
No, it doesn't have to be a neighboring district, and it would depend on whether Barberton and Talmadge have their borders open to outside students. If they did,
Okay.
then that can happen.
Okay, so you
Then
can go farther than neighboring districts.
yes, but the issue will be you don't get transportation to school. So parents, on the parent side, they need to think about that aspect of it. So when you open enroll, from one district to another, there's no transportation provided to that student.
Okay, so let's go cost per student now. Let's say student A lives in the Highland School
Hmm.
District, but wants to go to school in Wadsworth, the
Hmm.
neighboring school district. Is there two costs for that student? How does that work?
It'll be like typically the state share that's provided by the state will go with that student, but the local share would stay with the home district, and then the district that's receiving the student will have to make up the difference.
Oh,
And I think that's the financial
I
issue
was going
that
to say,
they
talk a
have to
little bit
figure out.
about that. That becomes
Again,
expensive.
right? If you have, if you're not getting a lot of state funding and that student leaves, the receiving district will have to make up some of that difference between that. And so, for some districts, it may be an expensive proposition to accept students from outside of the district. But then the other complicating factor is, I mean, no one wants to lay off staff. And
Right.
so when you look at your enrollment, is going to have an impact on the number of staff that you have and that you want to keep, or even the types of classes that you can offer. So if you have a smaller district, a smaller population, smaller class sizes, you may not be able to offer a variety of programs, and that's one of the issues that could have driven open enrollment for some students. So it is a very complex issue, and like I said, each district has to really examine that and
And,
evaluate it.
and David, these are the type of conversations that are going on. I'm not saying every day, but throughout these school districts that maybe us in the community don't understand. But these are really big subjects when you talk about getting the good education for the students, but yet being cost effective and looking fiscally inside your district.
Absolutely, particularly in light of, funding changes at the state level and proposed funding changes, that are in the pipeline. For instance, there's one bill being considered about eliminating property taxes by the year 2030. So, well, what's going to make up that funding stream for schools, from the state? So there are a lot of questions that have to be answered.
He's the executive director of the Summit Education Initiative, David James, with us. And David, you you can tell you've interviewed with me many times because that was my next question. I've been also hearing about possible changes in regards to funding coming into these school districts from Columbus. So touch on that for us.
Yeah, well, it's really, there's two parts to that. You know, we've seen, like, for certain federal grant programs, there have been some clawbacks on funds, and then at the state level, there's conversations about eliminating property tax, reducing property tax. I think there's a bill to look at changing the funding formula for schools. So a lot of district treasurers, I think, are apprehensive about what that's going to look like at the end. And so they're going to have to do some scenario planning on what that means for schools. I know there is a movement, in Ohio to eliminate property tax. So my question, and what's going to replace it, is the General Assembly going to, figure out a way to fund it outside of property tax? Are they going to increase the sales tax, which could negatively impact lower income Ohioans, both not just in urban areas, but in Appalachia, more rural areas? So there's a lot of questions, and I wish I had the answer and could see the future of it, but I don't. It's a very scary time. I think even, in the news this morning, one district to the south is looking at consolidating, and the other mitigating factor is enrollments have continued to decline, and they're projected to decline because there's just less kids. And so our colleges are facing that wave, of less kids, and the schools have been working through that for quite some time. So there are a lot of things at play in terms of how the state is going to support education, which is important because when you think about, our workforce, and remember, property tax doesn't just support schools. There are other institutions that are supported by property tax too. So, I mean, it's not just an education issue. It's going to be a general economic issue on how we're going to support, these agencies that serve citizens of Ohio. And my concern is, with school funding, is that it really is tied to economic development. We are, that which is one of the reasons, why Akron implemented college and career academies to get kids interested in these career choices earlier on. Number one, so they are still interested in getting their education, and then they can support the economy through getting, living wage employment and career opportunities post high school.
Those academies, to me, and I know you're very involved with that, along with the board and many others from the outside. It's a wheel of success, if you ask me. And I'm not. You and I have had many discussions
Yes.
on this. Is that as you mentioned, you get these students, preparing them for the next phase of their life, and these career academies get them into the workforce, or gets them a leg up on higher education, but gets them into the workforce in many places, and also continues to keep the young population workforce here in the Akron area, which keeps population going. It's really a wheel of success, and I really compliment you and many others who really built that strong. It's tough to rub, David, a crystal ball here.
Right.
But are we heading to where all these school districts are going to be mostly funded by the communities and how they see education, with maybe more levies and more increased levies? You and I have talked about school levies forever, but would it be Community A? And I want to move into Community A because they passed their school levies, and I want to be there because there's more dollars to education. And maybe I don't want to go to Community B because they don't see school levies that certain way and there's not as many dollars. Could we get to that point?
I mean, it's possible. I mean, the issue is, schools have relied on local community support for years.
Yes.
And, at the state level, they've made modifications to the funding formula. So there's been changes to how much funds local schools get. And it's been a challenge because, the cost of operating a business, operating your household, operating your schools, has continued to go up. And so it's just a very complex problem that we're facing in the state. And really, I think citizens, you, me, others in the community need to really decide, is education a priority and how important it is? Now, I no longer have kids in school, but it's still important for the youth in our community to receive a proper education. And there are many different options, out there. There are charter schools, there's parochial schools, and there's public schools. But I think, these educational options need to be supported. And our future as a society really does depend on our young people being prepared for what comes after school and when they grow up, so that they can be, contributing members to society. I think that's a very important aspect.
And then there's so many economic players in this, right? Because an older population might not have the money. I remember having this conversation with my parents
Yes.
years ago, and they said, well, we got to pay all this money in school taxes and everything. I said, well, Mom and Dad, remember that other families were paying for the three of us.
Yes.
When we came up through, it's kind of circle of education, but there are some seniors where maybe that dollar doesn't go as far in today's world.
And it is a balance, because we do realize that there are many seniors out there who are struggling.
Yeah.
And we've had those conversations in the past, during our levies, and we have talked about that issue that, when they had kids who were younger, they were supportive of levies because it helped their kids. But I think today it's even more critical that we have to make sure that, again, like I said before, young people are prepared, because that's what drives our economy. You're not going to attract businesses to Ohio if we have a workforce that isn't properly trained and adaptable for what's coming. And so it's just, there are a lot of challenges, and we really need to figure out a proper funding mechanism for schools today, which is a little different than it has been in the past.
David, thanks for coming in. Great insight, my friend, and thanks for getting up early and bringing it to the station. I appreciate it.
Always. Thank you.
There you go. Executive Director of the Summit Education Initiative, my good friend David James, with us in studio this morning.